Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss reparations. Now, this has been an issue that's been spoken of for many, many years, but it's gained more momentum with the anti-racism protests we're seeing globally, and of course within the United States, the UK, and other countries which have been part and parcel and have taken part in slavery in the past. The UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, has now spoken about how countries that were involved in the slave trade should, in fact, now make amends for that through reparations, as well as formal apologies and other such forms of truth-telling processes, etc. At this time. Now, of course, as I said, reparations is not something new. It's not a new topic that's been spoken about. In the past, it's been ridiculed. But back in 1865, too, through the research that I was doing, in fact, in the U.S., slaves were promised reparations of some sort. Slaves at that time, I should say, pardon me. And they were promised 40 acres of land, as well as a mule eventually as well. All of this was so that they would come into some sort of an equal footing with those who were once their slave owners. Now, of course, that now bringing to today's time would mean possibly trillions of dollars, according to many estimates of reparations. Does that make sense? How should all of this work? What exactly would a proper reparations look like at this time to try to bring those who were once enslaved into equal footing with the rest of the community, be it in the US or UK or elsewhere? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. And I'm joined by Westenley Alcenat, who teaches U.S. Atlantic and Afro-Caribbean history at Fordham University in the Bronx. He's previously also been at MIT and Harvard University. He is joining us this morning from New York. Joining us from Bristol is Madge, who is an honorary professor of historical studies at the University of Bristol. Madge and Westenley, thank you both for your time today. Westenley, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of reparations within the U.S. context as well as other contexts as well? How would this work? Do you believe it is gaining momentum?
I do believe it is gaining momentum. First, let me say thank you for having me. And this is a particularly very important day to actually have this conversation, because I'm not sure if you're aware, for your audience, today is actually known as Juneteenth, which was June 19th, was the day that the Union soldiers actually reached Texas, Galveston, Texas, and declared to enslaved people who had not known about the Emancipation Proclamation from 2 years earlier that had freed them. So that moment has remained in African-American history as a moment to celebrate the freedom that was secured through the Civil War. So moving on to reparations, I think given the conditions of the Black community as we know it, and as the world has more recently witnessed with the incident around the murder of George Floyd, what you are watching on your television screen is not just an issue of police brutality and racism, but deeply entrenched economic inequities having resulted from the consequence of slavery. So what I mean by that is, in part, the reason why the community has always been a prey for the police, as well as the larger structural violence that comes from the state, is because African Americans, as well as Black Americans more generally, have been living in a state of economic depravity. And much of the freedom that came out of emancipation in 1865 was very much sort of went in retreat by 1877 as Union forces retreated from the South, and the country more generally lost sight of the freedom that had been won and the legislative achievements that were made. So we were left with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, guaranteed citizenship, guaranteed freedom, of course. But none of that has actually come to what I would call economic citizenship for African Americans. So you have a community here that, by some estimate, only owns about 2% of the nation's wealth. And yet, by the time of the Civil War, African Americans as a group, in terms of enslaved people, made up more of the nation's wealth in terms of their value than every other asset combined, with the exception of the very land that they were working. So if you can understand that America's takeoff to being the wealthiest country in the world that it is today was built on the back of Black people, the back of African Americans, then you can understand not only just the moral argument for reparations, but the necessity of reparations in terms of giving back what was.
All right, Westenley, I'm just going to comment on that point because that's a very important point, and I wanted to, if you allow me, put that to Madge as well. Madge, you know, the argument, of course, when it comes to the moral issue on this, makes a lot of sense, right? But when it comes down to the actual numbers and how do we work this out economically, that's when many people on the other side, as you well know, Madge, would say this is simply impractical. That's even something that, if I'm not mistaken, President Obama had said that, is it really practical to enter into this discussion of reparations when it comes to, you know, the economic values that we may be attaching to this?
Well, it's particularly difficult now with COVID and all the crises that we're facing. But we have to do something because we know that our institutions right now of governance aren't fit for purpose for most people, particularly in America and in Britain, in terms of increasing inequalities of wealth. But the extra added layer of this long history of racial oppression and land grabs. And, you know, it's no accident that after the backlash in America, after the Civil War, you begin to get all those Confederate statues being implemented in southern cities at a very moment when they're trying to reinvent the history of the Civil War and enforce segregation in certain states. So the importance, I think, now is to think creatively and in a way that's inclusive for everybody about how best to make restitution. And there's been some really interesting initiatives. For example, in Britain, the University of Glasgow, which always sort of presented itself as an institution of enlightenment and anti-slavery, but actually a lot of their grants and behests were from people who had made their money off plantations and tobacco, et cetera. They've liaised with Barbados, the University of Barbados, University of the West Indies, and to the medical school to share expertise, medical training, et cetera, because Barbados has the highest rate per capita of amputations because of sugar. People were eating sugar. They were so impoverished right up until the 40s and 50s, 1940s and 50s. They were eating so much sugar that they have a very high diabetes rate. And so they're sharing expertise. They're empowering people. And I think those kind of creative things are really good. Perhaps in the States, new banking systems that are more cooperative, that don't help us invest in infrastructure rather than paying interest to corporate banks might be a creative way forward. So I think we have to think creatively. And I think in terms of apologies, I think obviously governments need to acknowledge and own up to, you know, how they have benefited from the enslavement and colonization of people from the empire. But they apologies can a lot of people who are white working class who felt that they were, exploited too, will say, well, why should I apologize for what I haven't done? Well, they don't realize how much they benefited indirectly from empire. But that needs to be done through education, et cetera. So
yeah, and on that point, Madge, if you allow me, because that's a good point that you made there, Westenley, on that point of who is really responsible in today's world for making this right? And I know I'm sure you've heard these arguments before, is that, listen, this generation didn't do this. This generation didn't enslave people, right? So why should this generation or those who are alive today be the ones held responsible for what their ancestors may have done that most likely they all disagree with? How do you respond to that?
It is true. It's an argument that I have heard often. The thing about it is the wealth of the nation benefits all of us. And the more recent incoming millions of immigrants, as far back as the middle of the 19th century to the late 19th century, when you had an influx of European immigrants coming to the country, all benefited from the wealth that had been created from slavery. So you cannot come into the situation privileged from a position in which you actually benefit from the wealth that had been created and yet say your hands are clean because you hadn't been there when it was being made. As long as you're able to claim one part of the nation's heritage, then you are automatically implicated in the larger part. So this is not a matter of who is to blame. It is not a matter of what your skin color is and whether or not that makes you party to the situation. It's understanding that the structural element of how slavery and racism conditioned the wealth that America built, and how that wealth was able to trickle to some part of the population while keeping another part of the population in a completely dispossessed position in terms of wealth and property, then you will better understand that this is not a matter of just individual responsibility. It's a collective societal responsibility. So this is really how I see it. And in that context, it's not really something to be argued against. In terms of the experiences of working class white Americans, immigrant white Americans who had come to this country, the privilege that they were able to benefit from in terms of a long history of white supremacy meant that you had easier access to credit, easier access to a certain social capital that Black America does not have because it was sequestered by segregation. Yeah. You did not have to suffer from redlining. If you came back from the war, whether that's World War I or World War II, your communities were not being targeted by people who never actually recognized the sacrifices that you had made on behalf of your country. Or you had, for instance, the great policies of the New Deal, much of which was restricted from the African-American community while giving broad access that created the large middle class of white Americans that we knew existed in the immediate post-war period. Okay. So all of that, so we're not just talking about here a situation of what is the historical consequences of slavery. We are also talking about what are the long-term trends that slavery left in its wake with regards to racism and who benefited from those structures of racism.
Okay, so on that subject of long-term consequences, right, Madge, and I want to give you the final word. We can talk, there's a slippery slope here, right? Because if we want to right all of these wrongs, then we also then have to look at those countries which were once colonies as well, right? And the effect that they've also suffered because of the colonization of their lands, and for many of them, their resources being taken away back to countries like England or otherwise. What do you make of that too? Because then we have to discuss that as well. How does that work? Because we know even till very recently, France, and I believe it still takes taxes from certain of its ex-colonies as well till today.
Well, you've given me some very big questions. I first want to say I agree with Stanley's assessment, particularly in the States. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the way in which immigration into Britain, which is a slightly different situation, has also is a product of British colonialism and imperialism. And I take on board all the points that he made. I'm not disputing that at all. I think the way forward in terms of restitution, et cetera, is for us to look for a new world order in which the rich just don't get richer and rip off everybody. And of course, historically, it's the West that has benefited the most at this moment. And I'm very glad the focus is on racial injustice. Its moment has come, but I think it's a wider issue. And I think we all have to acknowledge the oppressiveness at different levels of the power structure of various regimes in terms of the common people. So, we have had other empires in the past that have also colonized. It's the West moment was a particular moment after the opening of the Atlantic slave-based economy, and I think these are really big issues, and I think what we need to do is to be honest, historically informed, and have the welfare of everybody at stake. But right now, it's the moment to focus the spotlight on racial injustice and colonization from Europe.
Very well. We'll leave it there. We do sincerely appreciate both of our guests for their time and, of course, their expert insight. I know we've just touched the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to this issue of reparations. Westenley there was speaking to us this morning from New York, and Madge was speaking to us there from Bristol. Viewers, as I said, we've tried to give you just a macro view, right, when it comes to reparations, because there's not just talk of reparations and making right the wrongs done within the likes of the United States and the UK, but also then back in the respective colonies, especially when we're talking about the UK and its colonization of many countries around the world, and for many of the people, the very dismal conditions it left behind, i.e. when it left, or how it treated the people while it was still the colonial master, and its current relationship with those ex-colonies. We can talk about France, we can talk about many, many other countries that still treat a lot of their ex-colonies as their colonies, still very much. And for some of those countries, they're still paying taxes that those countries levied upon them when they left. So there's a lot to discuss here when it comes to reparations, making right the wrongs that were done against, be it the African-American community or the African community around the world as such, as well as, of course, other people of color and ethnic minorities also. I'll be back with my next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a report by Public Health England, PHE, which has said that possibly historical racism plays a huge part in England's higher BAME Covid-19 rate. And BAME, of course, standing for Black, Asian and minority ethnic, individuals who are less likely to, in fact, speak about their experiences of racism and or less access to equipment when it comes to if they're within NHS and their staff members there, access to PPE, and all of that has been an issue. And we've spoken about that, of course, previously on my show as well. But it seems that these sorts of reports keep coming out, yet we do not, at this point in time at least, have an understanding about whether the government's actually going to do something concrete. What we also know is that, in fact, the report about, part of the report, I should say, that was a part of where they were going to talk about the actual recommendations by PHE, that was censored originally by the government. They did not want to have a direct link made to racism or to historical racism within this report, and that, of course, is disturbing in and of itself, isn't it? Let's discuss all of that a bit further, and I'm joined by Mike Cole, who is a professor in the International Centre for Public Pedagogy at the University of East London. He's joining us now from Brighton. Joining us from Essex is Umar Kankiya, who is a former mental health lawyer. He's now a youth and communication specialist. He works with young people in the mental health sector. And we're also joined from Bristol by Saffron Karlsen, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. She's spent over 20 years researching drivers of ethnic inequalities in health. Saffron, Umar, and Mike, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Mike, let me start with you. What do you make of the PHE review? Again, this is not the first time that we're hearing that BAME that individuals within the BAME community are affected, of course, not just by the pandemic, but its ramifications.
Okay, can I just begin by saying there's another report that's come out since then, 6 hours ago, in fact, which shows that the coronavirus affects South Asian people once they go into hospital very badly. Yeah. In fact, they're most likely to die than any other group. And it's a major study. They looked at 4 in 10 of all hospital patients. And again, apparently details were passed on to SAGE, the government's scientific advisory group, more than a month ago. So this has been buried as well. But it's all part of a structural, systemic, institutional racism, which dates way back to the arrival of people from the former colonies in the post-war period and beyond that. So it doesn't surprise me at all. Over 20 years ago, the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry report admitted that there was institutional racism in major institutions in society, in the police, in the education system, and so on. So really, not much has changed, and the government says it's going to do another inquiry. I think what is needed is action. And I think we need to see all this in the context of the worldwide Black Lives Matter movement. And things need to change from the bottom up, I think, basically.
Indeed. And on that point, then, Saffron, do you feel that we will now have concrete measures taken, or will it just be, as Mike there alluded to, just inquiries for the sake of inquiries?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree that this is another sort of exercise in trying to detract attention away from the issue or in avoiding an opportunity to actually take conclusive action. I mean, the government's now been forced to publish the additional findings from the PHE report. So, as well as the research that was originally published a few weeks ago, we knew that over 4,000 people had also participated in Kevin Fenton's investigation and contributed evidence to his inquiry, and that evidence has now been released, and this further reinforces this idea of the importance this sort of institutional and structural racism in society and the need to address it. So there really isn't any need to have a further commission. We know exactly what's going on. We've known for a very long time what's going on. We now have clear recommendations for how to respond building on this other work. So there's no reason for further inquiry. We just need action. And I think the commission is a way to avoid actually engaging with this properly.
So then, Umar, we know, and I've spoken to you about this before as well, what exactly then needs to be done now? Like if we don't need another inquiry, all the facts are ahead of us, what does the government need to do?
I believe the government needs to take action. I mean, all of the facts are there, all of the figures are there, all of the statistics are there, and they need to take action and deal with the issues that are at hand. I'm absolutely fed up of hearing, and it's been a very common theme during the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, we're going to have a commission for this, a commission for that, we're going to have an inquiry into this, an inquiry into that, but none of it actually leads to anything. It's just, you know, we're talking for talking's sake. We know that, you know, BAME members of the community are grossly affected by COVID-19. So therefore, we understand this. Let's start to make the changes that are necessary to be able to address these inequalities that are affecting us throughout the whole of society. And I just think, you know, it's unacceptable that the government continue to stall on all of this, knowing the facts and the figures and the statistics that they have to hand to deal with it.
Mike, do you think that this government is well placed to be able to deal with these issues? Because some of them are very basic, right? So, I mean, you know, and I've spoken about this before on my show, about just access to PPE for NHS staff, those who are members of the BAME community. They have not had equal access to personal protective equipment throughout this pandemic. I mean, that seems like a very logical first step, right? Give them that equipment. And then, you know, let's take it step by step from there. But a lot of these issues, I imagine, once you take those further steps into this, would be quite complex. How does one deal with socioeconomic inequalities, which then lead to, obviously, you know, a vast difference in how healthy people or not are within the BAME community versus the rest of the community?
I think there's two major aspects to this. First, the chaos of the government, which seems to make up things as it goes along. I don't think it's well equipped to handle an issue like this at all. But it has to be seen more generally in the context of the hostile environment which was created when Theresa May was Home Secretary, continued under her premiership and continues with a vengeance under the premiership of Boris Johnson and Priti Patel as Home Secretary. So if you've got a hostile environment established, which, although it was claimed and is claimed to be just directed at so-called illegal immigrants, it affects all black and minority ethnic communities. And since we live in this atmosphere, it makes any kind of progress for racialized groups very, very difficult. So if you look at it in the context of a Tory government, Boris Johnson's well-known racist remarks that he's made over the years, to actually expect that such a government to be proactive in terms of the welfare of black and minority ethnic groups is a bit utopian. That's why I said at the start, I think action's got to be from the bottom up. And this is very clearly demonstrated by the worldwide protests we're seeing at the moment.
All right, so Saffron, do you agree that it be from the bottom up? Because as Mike there has correctly alluded to twice now, within the BLM protests that we're seeing around the world, and especially, of course, in the UK as well, there does seem to be public pressure, right, when it comes to a lot of these issues. Will that be enough?
I mean, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has actually led to significant change in a number of sort of areas more generally. So obviously you may be aware that in Bristol we had this very sort of high-profile pulling down of the Karlsen statue, who was one of our sort of chief slave traders back in the day. I mean, it was a significant moment for Bristol, but that followed 20 years of conversation about how to respond to this situation, whether the statue should come down, how it should come down, whether we should have a plaque recognizing this sort of legacy. So yes, we have had certain sort of action in response to pressure, but that we need to have some sort of positive response from those sort of higher ups in society, those in the powerful positions who can respond to this situation. You know, I think to add to sort of Boris Johnson's sort of racist remarks, and we see the people that have been recruited to run these different commissions, Trevor Phillips, who was the person first brought in to run the PHE or lead the PHE review, is currently suspended on suspicion of Islamophobic practice. You know, the person that's been brought in to run the commission is someone who has previously denied the existence of institutional racism in society. It just sort of doesn't really bode well for a very positive outcome in terms of the sorts of really deep-rooted structural and long-term changes that we need. I think another problem, bringing this back to COVID that I'll mention briefly, is there's also a real problem with the framing of these inequalities in terms of the ways in which the government and others are engaging with it. So like as we see with other research looking at ethnic inequalities and health and other issues, there's this sort of real effort to try and explain these differences according to sort of biological factors or genetic factors or cultural explanations. So there's something that people in these groups do or who they are which explains these inequalities. And these really ignore these structural factors, the ways in which these institutional racism, these structural racism actually produce these inequalities. And unless we really take that seriously, we won't be able to make the changes that we need.
You know, Umar, I imagine the likes of Johnson can respond to when we say that, listen, he's not well placed to be able to deal with these issues, to say that, listen, he has members of the BAME community within his own cabinet, right? Preeti Patel being one, and Sajid Javid in the past. You know, there are other, of course, members of the BAME community who serve with him. How would you respond to that? Because, you know, again, he would say, listen, I'm not racist.
Well, I think, you know, we have to make a very distinct we have to make a clear distinction about the term BAME anyway. I'm not a big fan of it because I think it very much just lumps in every single ethnic minority that's in existence in the country under one umbrella, which I think is grossly unfair. As you mentioned, you know, I am a former mental health solicitor, and I've just this week wrote a piece in the Gazette on industry newspaper, detailing what I think needs to happen in terms of addressing structural inequalities in the legal profession, but I do believe that needs to start with what happens in society. Boris Johnson has, let's be very clear, he has South Asian members of parliament that are serving in cabinet. We have Preeti Patel, who's Home Secretary. We have Rishi Sunak, who's the Chancellor. We have Alok Sharma, who's the Business Secretary. There are no black members of the cabinet that are at the table. So therein lies the problem. And I think when we're using the term BAME, I believe that is extremely unhelpful because it masks the fact that there is an inequality even that's going on within the use of that terminology. And I think it's very unhelpful when we're trying to deal with this. As the statistics have been quite clear, you know, black people are affected in one way when it comes to COVID-19. Asian people, you know, the study that Dr. Cole was saying before that came out this morning, you know, Bangladeshi people are affected twice as likely. So, you know, there are so many discrepancies and different ways in which COVID-19 affects us. And I think until we get to the point where we have true equality, and that does start from government downwards into society, we're not going to be addressing these problems. And I think all we're going to be seeing is continual brushing under the carpet and continual tokenism to say, yes, we've got BAME members in our cabinet, but actually we're not really digging deep into what the true issues are that are affecting all the communities.
You know, Mike, I was documentary the other day on BBC about just basic things like access to healthy food items within certain communities across the UK and lower class communities, if I may be honest with you, where a lot of these minority ethnic communities live, including, of course, the black community as well. And they don't have as much access to healthy foods. They have access to more fast foods. And I mean, I know that's a very small aspect in the larger scheme of things, but that, of course, affects the community's health, doesn't it? And I wonder, how does one deal with those sorts of things? Because as I put to you earlier, I imagine that when it comes down to these nitty-gritty details, this all gets very complex to try to fix.
Yeah, I think it's everything is very much tied up with social class. And yes, it's perfectly true that a lot of members of the black and ethnic minority ethnic communities, and I don't like the word particularly either, like Umar, I'll say why in a minute, it has to be related to social class, I think. And when you have a government and a cabinet full of millionaires who are looking after the interests of other people like themselves, then that's another factor that militates against any real structural change happening. One of the reasons I don't don't like black and minority ethnic because it hides racism directed at other groups. While anti-black, anti-Asian racism is very, very important facet of British life, there's other forms of racism. There's racism directed against Eastern European migrant workers, against the Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. There's anti-Semitism. There's various forms of racism which aren't directly related to skin colour, although skin colour is fundamental. So I don't think that's very useful. But I'd like to end, because I guess my bit is ending fairly soon, on a note of optimism. I'm very hopeful about the future in the coming together of the protests under Black Lives Matter, also the COVID protests and climate change. And they're all related in various ways. And I think, getting back to the point I've made twice now we've got mass movements around the world. I think what's happening in America is extraordinary, I think. So I think I would like to finish on a note of hope and optimism. People need to take more control of their lives and of the society in which they live.
You know, Saffron, as I like earlier, about just the issues of access to healthy food, for example, right? Because if we're talking about health and you know, how healthy a community is, then of course all of those sorts of things come into play. And if healthy food or healthy food items are more expensive than fast food, then obviously logically you just put fast food on the table, right? Because that's what you can afford. How does a government overcome that? Do you just subsidize that? I mean, how does that work?
Well, again, coming back to what I was saying before about the ways in which the government and others have engaged with these ethnic inequalities in COVID-19, it's again, I think the starting point is understanding what is actually driving these differences and these inequalities. So often we've had conversations about ethnic differences in dietary practices, and they've been explained far more in relation to these ideas that people have particular cultures which encourage them to eat in particular ways. So for a long time we had conversations about whether people used too much ghee in making their curry, which would explain high levels of diabetes among certain Asian groups, and so on and so forth. But actually, as you pointed out, and as the others pointed out before, what's far more likely to explain ethnic differences in dietary practices are about the economic issues related to accessing good quality food, or what we might consider a healthy lifestyle. So if we consider that it's a sort of economic issue underpinned by sort of structural racism, rather than a problem of culture, the problem of a victim-blaming attitude, which assume that these people need to be fixed in order to be made healthy, then that encourages us to move in a very different direction in terms of policy. It requires a much more fundamental response, which addresses all the parts that we sort of play, and understanding how we as a society encourage everybody to be more healthy.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as our final word, unfortunately, but the clock has gotten the best of us. But we do sincerely appreciate all three of our guests for their time and, of course, the context that they've brought to the discussion. That was Saffron speaking to us from Bristol. Earlier, we were joined by Umar from Essex, and Mike, who was speaking to us there from Brighton. Now, this issue of the BAME community, and of course, there are issues with just that title, as well as it groups in a lot of the minority ethnic communities across the UK, essentially all of them really into one title, and that in and of itself may be problematic, as our guests, especially Mike and Omar, has spoken about. When the breakdown happens, it's important to see that breakdown. It's important to see how the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as racial inequalities, affect each of these different communities in different ways, and each of those, of course, needs to be dealt with. Nevertheless, it's important to see them each individually also. Is this government well placed to deal with that? Our guests do not think that it is, even if they do have, even if the government does have, especially South Asian minorities, represented quite vastly within its cabinet. But nevertheless, it seems that that's more symbolic than actually effective of positive realities on the ground for these ethnic minority communities, be it the Black community or others in the UK. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.